In this video, I give an overview of the two key readings on the topic of resisting inequality by Scott and Kerkvliet. So why are these the key readings for the topic? Why do we make you read these two articles? Well, both Scott and Kerkvliet argue that we must move beyond narrow understandings of political behaviour to recognise how people's everyday actions and practices have much wider political implications. And they both argue that conventional analysis has neglected this hugely important dimension to political life. Scott, a writer who we've encountered before on the unit, argues that there is a hidden dimension of subversive forms of resistance to authorities, which he calls everyday resistance. He argues that such everyday subversion shows that people do not consent to inequality and that resistance to domination is in fact much more widespread than many analysts recognise. Kerkvliet, who was originally actually a PhD student of Scott's, agrees with much of what Scott says, but he also makes some important criticisms of Scott and takes up a rather different position. He argues that there is a continuum in everyday politics, and by that he means how people's daily practices support or undermine the rules and the powers that be. At one end of the continuum of everyday politics, which is how people negotiate rules and authorities, we can see consent and compliance. At the other extreme end, we can see resistance. But in between consent or resistance, Kerkvliet says we can see evasion or modification of the rules. Now here people bend or break the rules to make their lives easier, but they are not necessarily intentionally defying the authorities. For Kerkvliet, that means that not all rule breaking is resistance, and he thinks a lot of what Scott calls everyday resistance is in fact really only forms of self-help. So these two readings ask us to think about what we really mean by resistance, and it's up to you who you find a more persuasive set of arguments. So let's start with Scott. He makes an argument, and we've already encountered a version of this argument in key readings from previous topics, both his own argument from topic 4, but also in the key readings by Piven and Cloward and Bayer when we were looking at protesting inequality. Scott argues that exploited people are constrained in their options, but that doesn't prevent them countering repressive domination. But if they want to do so, they must use quiet, ambiguous or disguised forms of everyday resistance, especially in situations where open confrontation is simply too risky because they risk punishment or repression. Scott argues that conventional accounts adopt far too narrow a view of political action and class struggle. They focus on conventional accounts focus on public, open or organised forms of protest and conflict, ignoring the dispersed, private or hidden forms of resistance, what he calls everyday resistance. So because exploited people are constrained in their options, they must use ambiguous or disguised forms, which he calls weapons of the weak. So everyday resistance is a form of defensive political action and includes activities such as squatting, poaching, deserting in the case of army recruits, pilfering, tax evasion and so on. He says such forms of resistance have typically been missed in most accounts of class relations, partly because the aim of those practices is to avoid notice and detection. They're beneath the surface, as it were. People engage in everyday resistance in a disguised form to avoid open challenge and open retaliation. And that means that analysts as well as authorities sometimes miss these forms of resistance, for Scott at least. So Scott argues that acts of everyday resistance often represent a form of individual self-help. He says it requires little or no organised coordination, and it typically avoids direct confrontation with authority. He says what is distinctive about tactics of everyday resistance is that they are creeping incremental strategies in which people push against the rules, often in a secretive or disguised manner, just to see what happens, to see if they can get away with it. But they're also ready to retreat and say, well, I didn't really mean to disobey the rules if the authorities push back. Now, for Scott, that's because power relations shape what people can do, as well as the public performances that they adopt. He says subordinates have to give the impression of compliance, but if we really want to see their true feelings, we have to look at how they behave behind the backs of the powerful. Where when they're in public view, they often appear compliant, but he says if you look behind the scenes, there's much more dissent and resistance. So he says that the relative safety of everyday forms of resistance has to do with the small scale of the action. He says, squatters creep into the land, often at night, to avoid calling attention to themselves. Deserters are likely to slip away unnoticed when the opportunity arises. He says they may be beneath notice, and often, from the perpetrator's view, they're designed to be beneath notice. They're small acts, they're surreptitious acts, but he says collectively they can turn into a large event. So an army can become too short of conscripts to fight if enough people desert. A workforce whose foot dragging can bankrupt the enterprise, and so on. So he says he also argues that while they are individual acts, they do depend on some tacit level of cooperation from other people in subordinate or oppressed positions. It doesn't require collective action, but often it depends on the kind of, he says, the complicitous silence of other people in the same situation. They depend on a minimal level of group cohesion, on other people not giving away the fact that you're breaking the rules. Now, everyday resistance is an argument that actually there's much more dissent and resistance to authorities, to power relations, to domination than much analysis suggests. Kerkvliet offers a slightly different perspective on this. So Kerkvliet agrees with Scott that we need to broaden our understanding of political behaviour, but he also disagrees with Scott on certain major points, which I will come back to. But firstly, what does he say? Kerkvliet argues that politics should be the analysis of who gets what, when and how. But he sees, like Scott, limits to conventional understandings of political action with much too narrow a focus on government, states and organised activism. He says that wrongly puts politics in a realm far away from most citizens, but also misses a great deal of what is politically significant in everyday life. So Kerkvliet essentially sees three different kinds of politics: official politics, advocacy politics and activism, but also everyday politics. And everyday politics for Kerkvliet means the political significance of our own everyday activities, where simply by going about our own lives we can either help to reproduce social arrangements or change them. So it's the political dimensions of our own daily practices and behaviours. Not marching on the streets, but going to work and so on. So he argues that we need to look at how the things that we all do regularly has an effect on politics, who gets what, and how power relations are either accommodated or challenged. He says being conscious of politics as an everyday experience makes us mindful of how our own actions and relationships reinforce, amend, evade or contest the political systems of which we are a part. And he's making an argument that we need to recognise that ordinary people, simply by going about their daily lives, strongly affect the political systems in which they are a part. Typically that occurs in quiet, mundane ways and through actions that are rarely organised or overtly political. So everyday politics for Kerkvliet involves little or no organisation. It's usually low profile and private behaviour, and is done by people who probably do not regard their actions as political. Nonetheless, he says they have very important political consequences. Now, so far, Kerkvliet's argument has many similarities to Scott's. But Kerkvliet sees different forms of everyday politics, and he distinguishes support, compliance, modifications and evasions from resistance. Now he argues that the form of everyday politics that's been most studied, and that's partly to do with Scott's intervention, is everyday resistance. But he also points out that there are other forms of everyday politics, which he says may not be about resistance at all. He argues there is a continuum in how and why people negotiate rules and authorities or engage in everyday politics. He says between everyday compliance and everyday resistance, there are also everyday modifications and everyday evasions of what authorities expect or the political system presumes. And he says, everyday modification and evasion often convey indifference to the rules. But they are often typically things people do while trying to cut corners so as to get by. But he says that while such evasions or modifications of the rules might look like everyday resistance, he says they're not. So he's here arguing that not all rule breaking or non-compliant practices which push against what the authorities tell us to do, he says not all of those activities are really resistance. Kerkvliet argues that we must distinguish as practices which are intended as resistance from practices which might look like resistance, but which are actually simply the consequence of people going about their everyday activities. He says even if people are cutting corners, breaking or reinterpreting the rules, these activities may just result from various forms of self-help or self-organisation. And he says to see that as everyday resistance is to conflate different kinds of activities. Now, he says, to see indifference to the rules as resistance, that's an easy mistake to make because often such forms of self-help or self-organisation can have, significant transformations of political systems, but in an unintended way. So the argument here is that non-compliant practices which emerge from self-help don't necessarily indicate a wider sense of injustice or opposition to inequality or power relations. Nonetheless, very significant social changes can arise from these strategies of self-help. So they're not insignificant. He says they're just not resistance. So to give an example of this, he talks about how major change can result from modification and evasion of the rules. In the case of Vietnam, he says in Vietnam, a major reversal of national policy on collective farming occurred, he says, through everyday modification and evasion. There was no social upheaval, there was no violence, there wasn't a change in government, there wasn't even organised opposition. There's no social movements involved here. To give you some context, in the 1950s in Vietnam, the Communist Party government had imposed cooperative farming on peasant households. So these, you had to farm in a land cooperative. But he says these cooperatives rarely functioned in the way intended, with individual households doing most of the actual work. And by 1988, the policy had been abandoned, largely under the pressure of the everyday non-compliant practices of the individual villages doing the work, which led to the eventual collapse from within of these cooperative enterprises. So it emerged the collapse from non-compliance, but he says the non-compliance really was about everyday modifications and evasions rather than straightforward resistance. Because he says that the subversions which led to the collapse of the policy were generally not acts of defiance, because there were really a very wide variety of intentions in play. So people took the collective land for themselves out of the conviction they could farm it better individually, or as preemptive measures to stop other people seizing the land. To get grain, they presumed other members would steal because people didn't trust each other, or from rivalries between neighbouring villages, because neighbouring villages were often involved in these cooperatives. So he says this shows the very large numbers of ways people make paths of their own rather than sticking to the rules that the officials tell us to do. He says such deviations can variously arise from people seeking to make their work easier, or because they felt entitled to stray from the kind of rules because they saw other people straying. So he says clearly such practices convey indifference to the rules and people doing what they think they can get away with, but they are typically the things that people do while trying to cut corners, just so as to get by or to get a little bit of an advantage for themselves. So he says they might look like everyday resistance, but they're not. Why aren't they everyday resistance? He says because they do not intentionally impose superiors or advance claims at odds with the authorities' interests. So that raises a question, what does Kerkvliet see as resistance then? He adopts a narrower definition of resistance than Scott. For Kerkvliet, resistance refers to what people do that shows disgust, anger, indignation, or opposition to what they regard as unjust, unfair, illegal claims on them by people in higher, more powerful class positions or status positions or institutions. He says resistance means intentionally contesting the claims of people in superior positions, or advancing claims which are at odds with what superiors want. He says acts at the expense of other people who are in the same or the similar boat, so people with the same social position, is not resistance. So remember in the case of the Vietnam cooperatives, people often seized land because they had rivalries with neighbouring villages. Those weren't people in superior positions, they're broadly in the same social position. So for Kerkvliet, that is not, if you're not aiming up, it's not resistance. So we can see two elements here. You must intentionally be defying authorities. You must be trying to resist for something to be resistance. And acts of resistance must only be aimed up. If it harms other subordinate groups, your activities, that's simply sectional self-interest. It's not resistance. So that means, it's a narrower definition of resistance. It suggests there's less resistance to authorities, to domination, to power relations than Scott suggested. Scott's argument is that people don't comply with the authorities because there's all these acts of everyday resistance. Well, Kerkvliet is saying, well, hang on a minute, that quite a lot of these acts are simply self-help. They're not resistance. So to think about this further in the workshop, how exactly do everyday modifications and innovations differ from resistance? And you might look at the definitions that the two authors give. Then also, what do you think? Do you agree that acts are only resistance if they intentionally oppose authorities and are only aimed upwards and not sideways as well? And then finally, why does all of this matter? Why would we want to take everyday modifications, invasions, or indeed everyday resistance into account when thinking about people's response to social inequalities? How does it change our understanding of subjective inequality?